Nonviolence section. How to kill and mutilate a body while respecting the principle of nonviolence. We have seen how stressed the respect also paid in Lama's Tibet to the life of flies and insects. Yet his description of the feasts of the aristocracy discloses a rather different picture. Quote, "Course after course, I counted 40. I must be excused from mentioning all the delicacies that were offered to us." End quote. Not all of them evidently vegetable. There is no doubt that Gandhi's vegetarian diet was not the norm here. If at all, something like it applied de facto to the popular classes, who had to make do with an, quote, insufficient diet. Quote, "The poor man lives generally on sampa, butter tea, and a few radishes with some paprika," end quote, meat being too expensive. For the higher castes, the problem of fidelity to the Buddhist prescription of respect for every life form was resolved by a stratagem that was, in its way, brilliant. Butchers were members of a lower caste, for the most part Muslim in religion, and there was nothing to prevent eating meat provided by the perverse behavior of sinners and infidels. Hare continues thus, beginning of long quote. It follows from this principle of respect of every form of life that there is no capital punishment in Tibet. Murder is regarded as the most heinous of crimes, but the murderer is only flogged and has iron fetters forged onto his ankles. It is true that the floggings are in fact less humane than the death penalty as it is carried out in Western hands. The victim often dies an agonizing death after the penalty has been inflicted, but the religious principle has not been infringed. End quote. Thus, on closer examination, the death penalty did indeed exist, only it was carried out with stratagems similar to those implemented to maintain the nobility's clear conscience during lavish feasts based on various kinds of meat. Let us once again attend to the eulogist of Lamaist Tibet. Beginning of long quote. "I was told of a man who had stolen a golden butter lamp from one of the temples in Kirong. He was convicted of the offense, and what we would think an inhuman sentence was carried out. His hands were publicly cut off, and he was then sewn up in a wet yak skin. After this had been allowed to dry, he was thrown over a precipice." End of quote. The culprit was, merely, subjected to mutilation. Death, so it was said, supervened by the will of God. And once again, with the clear conscience thus acquired, the most drastic violence could be used in the fight to defend public order, like the amputation of the arm inflicted on captured robbers. In this case, too, what determined the unlikely survival of the culprit was the will of God. Things could be entrusted to the latter in various ways. The condemned man's mutilated body was shut up in a case that was then thrown into a river. Or, having been flogged at length, the wretch was tethered to a rock and ended up dying of exposure during the night. Straightforward flogging held out greater possibilities of survival. However, if sufficiently prolonged, it too could have a fatal outcome. In all these instances, what determined the death of the unfortunate was the inscrutable divine will. In Lamaist Tibet, what immediately followed the death penalty in order of severity was a punishment depriving the victim of both eyes. The use of violence against the culprit's body was a very widespread practice. A Briton who was resident in Lamaist Tibet for decades reports having attended countless operations of extractions of the eyes and general mutilation of the body. Another British witness recounts having everywhere come across men deprived of an arm or leg after having been found guilty of theft. This system of penalties characterized Lamaist Tibet throughout its history. As late as 1950, the American magazine Life published a photograph of a flogging, staged in the center of Lhasa, which saw the culprit subjected to 200 to 250 lashes. The most serious forms of body mutilation, removal of the eyes, were mainly entrusted to the caste of untouchables, for the purposes of distancing this form of particularly atrocious violence from a society that maintained its devotion to the precept of nonviolence. End of section.